class. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 6, Section 5. We're going to talk about the fall of Rome. And one of the things that I want you to think about is, can an empire be too big to fail? Well, that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. The Roman Empire was pretty spectacular. I mean, as far as the amount of territory that it covered and the vast number of peoples that lived within it. But after a series of really lousy leaders, the Roman Empire just wasn't what it used to be. So, take a look at number one. The Roman Empire around AD 200s gradually began to decline due to a lot of weak leaders. And some of these leaders were really notorious for being super lousy. Pictured down below here is kind of a painting that was probably done during the Renaissance of the great fire that consumed Rome. And this would have been during the time of Emperor Nero, who was really kind of what they would call like a megalomaniac. This guy was kind of on a big ego trip. And so big that there have always been rumors about who started the fire in Rome. I hate to say that, for a time, it was kind of blamed on Jews. And this kind of probably brings about some of these sentiments of anti-Semitism that are always going to be kind of in the background of Western European history. But the rumor was also that Nero, being a big egomaniac that he was, wanted a backdrop, a dramatic backdrop for reading poetry. And so he set the city on fire. Well, nevertheless, Nero would eventually not rule for much longer after this point in time. So aside from these really lousy leaders, there were also economic problems. We had inflation, which is a modern problem that we deal with, civil wars throughout the empire, and there was always that threat of invasion. During this period of time, we're going to hear more about the rise of barbaric groups of people that at times are going to come in and threaten the Roman Empire's stability. Number two, Rome needed to increase its armies to protect itself from the growing threat of invasion. And raising an army isn't cheap. Keeping a military on duty at all times is going to cost a lot of money. And if the empire isn't bringing in revenues from taxes or such, they're going to have to find ways. And for the most part, this is going to mean that we're going to have to raise prices, and eventually people aren't going to be able to buy as much with the money that they have. And people start grumbling. And when people start grumbling, bad things happen. Take a look at number three. There were a handful of rulers that would eventually take the helm of Rome that really wanted to reform the empire. And one of them was a guy named Diocletian. He created an absolute monarchy. Absolute monarchy is, kind of like making yourself a king or an emperor, but the idea is that you have complete and total power. So, for the most part, Diocletian wasn't sharing power with the Senate. Some people might have seen this as a way to kind of sequester their voice, meaning that they wouldn't be able to take their complaints to the Senate and to have them hear that. And so that might have made some people a little uneasy. He also split the Roman Empire into two sections. Okay, and you can kind of see down here on the map, we have kind of the Western Division. It's capital basically in Rome. And eventually he's going to make an Eastern Roman Empire, aka what would eventually be known as Byzantine, or the Byzantine Empire. So, as a result of these actions, many Romans may have seen these actions as those of a power-hungry ruler, and this caused him to create so much bureaucracy and eliminated many of the personal freedoms that the people had enjoyed under previous leaders. And when people feel like their freedoms are being taken away, they get a little grumpy, and hence we have that threat of invasion. All right, moving forward. Diocletian and his co-emperor at some point in time decided that they would retire at the same time. And the idea of retiring at the same time might have been a way to kind of keep the power in balance, because these two new Caesars could rise and become co-emperors at the same time. But unfortunately, in time, there would be quarrels that's going to erupt. And around 312, we have the rise of a man named Constantine. We mentioned Constantine just a little bit ago with the Edict of Milan, in a sense, um, kind of bringing stability, at least to the Christian world. He was a great supporter of Christianity, but he also moved the Roman capital out of Rome, to eventually what would be the city known as Constantinople. Today, Constantinople is known as Istanbul, which is the capital, or one of, I should say, one of the larger cities within the country of Turkey. Constantine, when he was a younger man, had a kind of a strange vision when he was leading troops into battle. And at this point in time in his life, he wasn't a Christian. He was still probably worshiping those Roman gods and goddesses. But he had seen a vision in the sky of a cross. And he took that as a sign that, maybe, there is a higher power that was looking down upon him. And perhaps maybe this power shined upon him that day in battle and gave him that victory. He wouldn't forget that. And on his deathbed, he would eventually be baptized and converted to Christianity. Number 5. In the 8400s, we had many Germanic tribes that were fleeing a group of barbarians from the east known as the Huns. You might have heard of one of their famous leaders, Attila the Hun, who kind of came out of what would have been probably parts of Mongolia or parts of Central Asia in general. They were also joined by a group known as the Vandals. The Vandals were primarily from parts of Germany and France. Both of these groups eventually would attack Rome and North Africa. These attacks caused all sorts of economic instability, and you also had some weak leadership at that point in time that caused the empire to start collapsing. The Huns and the Vandals, they used barbaric and also unethical tactics to conquer these new lands. And both of the tribes, for the most part, were destructive and violent, with little regard for innocent human lives. When we talk about the Vandals in general and some of their practices, this is where we get this concept of what is known as vandalism. You can see our Roman statue here, and the fact that this Vandal has taken his, probably looks like a sword, and chopped off the head of that statue. Attila the Hun, you know, there were many that were living in fear of him and his men, but they weren't quite able to conquer the city of Rome. But they did terrorize a good portion of the empire, and there were parts of the empire that were eventually taken over by these different barbaric tribes. Number 6. By the mid AD 400s, Attila the Hun had attacked Gaul or France, but was turned back when the Romans allied with another group of barbarians known as the Visigoths. Visigoths were what would be a group of barbarians that kind of lived in parts of what would be modern-day Spain and southern France. Anyway, Attila then turned on Rome, but was persuaded to leave by a man named Pope Leo I, or aka Leo the Great. And hence Leo becomes one of the great popes within the history of the Roman Catholic faith. By AD 476, the Western Roman Empire was eventually defeated by a guy named Odoacer, who is this guy right here. And when Odoacer came in with his group of barbarians, they pretty much leveled the city. And some people say they kind of started what would be known as kind of a dark age that's going to happen within Western Europe. During this period of time, all these great advances that were made by the Romans would be kind of lost. And at some point in time, we're going to have to rebuild, and it's going to be a long, tedious process. Nevertheless, in the East, that empire would endure for centuries, and it would be known as the Byzantine Empire. Eventually, it would be taken over when we have the rise of Islam. That's going to happen around the year 600 or so. All right, well, thank you very much for listening.